The Japanese garden is the world's preeminent landscape art form for evoking nature's beauty in three-dimensional space. Centuries of design evolution have produced a rich vocabulary of styles and a set of principles shaped by observation of nature and human perception. Experiencing nature through the senses is at the heart of Japanese gardens, and this vital art form continues to evolve in response to human needs and changing culture. Here we demystify the process of creating and maintaining Japanese-style gardens through the work of designer David Slawson, particularly his garden at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. The context-sensitive design and maintenance process is broken down into its component parts: response to site, client, and local materials, all timeless sources of inspiration that David calls the Accord Triangle. We will show how the same methods used by the garden's designer can guide the committed gardeners, artists and co-creators in their own right, who tend this living work of art in succeeding decades. The emotional impact of a garden depends on the quality of its care, but how is the designer's original inspiration, the garden's unique experience of natural beauty, tended and even improved year by year in creative response to the challenges that come with time? As questions like this are answered, we come to understand the garden as a work of art in progress.
That I know I can come here and it's going to be in perfect proportion, and if I'm feeling off or I'm feeling a little down, this kind of beauty and this kind of balance has a real effect on the psyche and on the body, and it's something I think we all crave at some level, and we get it in different ways, and this is a very predictable place to come to get that, to experience it.
If we're in a good mood and feeling peaceful with ourselves and the world around us, you can feel that when you come in the garden. The garden should feel I think I want the garden to have the feeling of joy and contentment. And if you're not feeling that when you walk in the garden, then I'm not doing my job right.
By coming here, it allows me and possibly others, I think, to enter a place that's very hard in this 21st century. It gives us permission to slow down, to stop, to just sit and let nothing happen, if that's what is the right thing. Clear one's mind. It's like a fresh glass of water.
The power of an authentic Japanese landscape garden to create deep feelings in both the viewer and the gardener are quite remarkable. Successful gardens evoke profound feelings of contentment, peace, and a sublime appreciation for the inherent harmony of the natural world. But what makes a successful garden, and how, over time, might the gardener maintain and even elevate the impact of the garden on the visitor's aesthetic response? At its heart, the answer is good design, well executed. The Japanese landscape designer must find a way to bring into harmony the nature of the garden site, the needs of his or her client, the garden's owner, and the materials which will be used to create the art form. Once this is accomplished, the gardener may then build upon this solid foundation an enduring and ever-improving work of landscape art. At the heart of Japanese garden design is the need to create a resonance between what we view in the garden and the feelings that are naturally evoked when we encounter beauty in the natural world. The garden site serves as the stage or setting within which this resonance will occur. In our example, a suitable site was found in a corner of the Carleton College campus. For designer David Slawson, this setting offered two possible design elements. The native white cedar, planted along the south and east sides of the lawn, could serve as a natural backdrop for the garden, which in turn would be viewed from the shelter of a mixed grove of canopy trees on the north side. Later, Slawson was deeply moved by an aerial view of the undulating Minnesota River, and knew immediately that he wished to incorporate that view into the garden's design. Combining this feeling with the beauty he saw in other landscapes, like this Duluth area river view, or a nearby bluff arising out of an outwash plain, Slawson soon came up with an inspired plan. David Slawson's garden clearly shows how the designer responds to features in the local landscape. The undulating shoreline, rising promontories, and winding stream would all resonate with a visitor who lives in the area. The dry lake bed that dominates the heart of the garden is a common view in this land of 10,000 lakes. As originally conceived, the existing maple trees provide shelter for the viewing structure located on the north side of the garden, and the arbor vitae serve as a backdrop for the garden's primary view or frame. Rocks are a prominent feature in the garden plan. The guiding principle of using local materials led Slawson and his team of volunteers to search farm fields around Northfield and quarries in nearby towns for suitable candidates. They even traveled to the north shore of Minnesota's Lake Superior to find stone suitable for the stone waterway that cascades down out of the southeast corner of the garden. Not surprisingly, all of the plant materials included in the garden plan are either native to Minnesota or hardy species that evoke the desired qualities at the garden scale. And so the garden begins.
Doing a little homework, finding out exactly what kind of plant materials work, visiting gardens, whether they're Japanese gardens or not, any garden, and seeing what plant materials they like, what kind of environment speaks to that person. If a mountain stream is the ideal place that brings you happiness, what are the elements about being there that bring you joy or peace? Is it the water, the rocks, the babbling sound of the water, the plant materials that grow along the bank? What is it that evokes that feeling in that person that's building their own garden? And sometimes it's amazingly simple, though, to create the images in someone's mind. You don't need to have a huge roaring stream to create the impact of a stream.
Experiencing the garden is a dynamic process, with the design continuously playing on how we as humans respond to certain lines, shapes, and textures. We are encouraged to enter the garden, move along its paths, pause, move on, and occasionally stop, sit, and reflect. This occurs because the designer has woven a tapestry of sensory cues into the garden's underlying structure. In Japanese-style gardens, the primary compositional technique is asymmetrical balance. Unlike symmetrical balance, where one side of the design is a mirror image of the other, asymmetry is always disposed differently on either side. A symmetrical design like the Taj Mahal may be awe-inspiring, but it also feels like a power center opposed to our body. Asymmetrical balance, however, makes us feel connected to the landscape we are experiencing and is partly responsible for the feeling of tranquility we associate with Japanese gardens. In the Carleton Garden, asymmetrical balance is everywhere. At every point along an arc that describes the main view of the garden, we glimpse a series of individual compositions that separately and in combination are asymmetrically balanced. By joining the scene's focal points of interest with imaginary lines, compositional triangles emerge. Their unequal sides suggest asymmetrical balance. As we move along the garden's pathways, the same asymmetry leads our eyes in a series of long oblique lines that zig and zag back into space. Even as we physically move along a straight path, our gaze is directed in slanting sideways motions into the garden's interior. This kind of diagonal movement also enhances the sense of space, even in a small garden like Carleton's. Within this framework of asymmetrical balance, certain cues are used to signal vantage points, places in the garden where special scenes are revealed to the viewer. In the Carleton Garden, wide, flat stones are placed at key vantage points. Here, in front of the water basin, the stone step in the path, the diagonal line of which orients viewers to the focal mountain composition, and in front of the benches of the viewing shelter itself, which serves as the primary vantage point. Here, the pattern of stones in the path encourages the visitor to slow down and stop at the shelter. Once seated, there is a perfect view of the entire garden and all its elements. The primary view is composed of 3 zones. The foreground consists of the gravel lake and overlook rock. A landscape of boulders, plantings, and undulating shoreline serve as the primary landscape composition in the middle ground, and a linear grove of arborvitae trees form the background. The scene is carefully framed on the bottom by the paved stone path, and by tree branches and leaves overhead. To reinforce and deepen this experience, the viewing shelter and benches create a sense of refuge which says, "Sit and linger in your viewing." Like a nest, it embraces and protects the viewer from outside sounds and weather, while at the same time putting the viewer in intimate touch with the garden, as if it were made for him or her alone. Its natural materials and method of joinery are in perfect harmony with the spirit of quiet listening. This is where viewers with the time to linger feel most comfortable and refreshed. Other places of refuge with vantage points of the garden are the curving redwood benches with their overhanging foliage, and the picture window view from the adjoining dormitory. Over the course of time, new needs in the garden's periphery have been used as opportunities to improve the design. For example, when Carleton College wished to have a new sidewalk where students had beaten a path through the arborvitae grove and across the lawn to Watson Hall, David Slawson worked with the college on a design which would complement the garden. Slawson came up with an elegant solution, an S-curve walk in exposed aggregate, with a new vantage point for the garden at the path's midpoint. As you move along the path from either direction, a small island of rock, mounded earth, and small tree encourage pedestrians to pause and view.
The idea of pressing the leaves into the concrete is to give it a subtle feel of being a walk through the woods.
Okay.
So when you would be walking, you would see leaves in the fall that tumble onto the sidewalk, and these will be there all year long then. So the effect is to be subtle and not highly dramatic.
Might have to use your hand to help it out a little bit to get it. You're going to want to curl. Okay? And that's where we run into the trouble. It's almost like ironing clothes. Yeah. All right. That's what I was going to use as a... That's why I didn't want to work out the cut marks, because we're going to be working so much.
They'll look down and notice, oh, there are leaves in here. And then they'll notice more. And then the entire journey down the sidewalk will have more meaning to them and will be a little more special each time they notice something else in the concrete. It's like a gift at Christmas, and it just keeps unwrapping a little at a time. so they will hopefully find it a journey that's interesting every time they walk across it. So that particular stone at the end down there will make that transition from the sidewalk to the stone path and be the welcome mat to this portion of the garden where people will know, this is an entrance. This is something a little different than the regular concrete paths that are around the garden. The stepping stone idea fits in and makes a smoother transition. It's comfortable, it's a little more organic and natural than the concrete. So you make the transition to the concrete and you're starting to get into the more formal areas of the garden itself. The more specifically, this is the garden area.
Rocks serve as the garden's bone structure. They are selected and placed to suggest the various ways rock occurs in the landscape. Their qualities reflect both the type of scenery being evoked, whether mountain, hillside, stream, or ocean shore, and such geologic forces of uplifting, folding, faulting, and erosion that give a rock its particular shape and character. Because underlying structure has such a primal impact on our senses, the proper placement of rocks and landforms is critical to the garden's success. Placement not only defines the garden space, but also reflects the pleasing dynamic sense of asymmetrical balance that is found throughout the garden's design. One of the most important and rewarding tasks is finding rocks to evoke the desired scenic and sensory effects. As Slawson is looking for rocks, he notes their size, shape, color, and texture. For rocks that evoke mountains, he looks for pyramid shapes that are craggy with jagged or stepped edges. For rocks on a shoreline, shapes with smooth or convoluted contours that look dashed by waves. Rocks for a headland may combine mountain qualities with those of a wave-dashed shore, while a sandy beach may have worn, recumbent rocks. Preferred rock colors are subdued, deeper hues such as gray, blue, or greenish-gray, maroon, and chestnut brown. Slawson advises that we look at many rocks, and by comparing their features, feel how some convey the desired quality much better than others. Ultimately, observation of nature's myriad forms is the best teacher. Rocks are typically positioned in odd-numbered groups of 3, 5, 7, and so forth. Odd numbers suggest a sense of incompleteness and flow to other parts of the design. They are also perfectly fitted to asymmetrical design. Within any particular cluster, the placement of rocks conveys a direction of visual force. We associate the vertical with the powerful force required to oppose the Earth's gravity, and so it evokes a heroic upward soaring feeling. The horizontal plane, associated with level earth and bodies of water, evokes an expansive, easy gliding movement, and therefore feels serene. Here the diagonal plane predominates. It is associated with the tipping of balance, when vertical objects upthrust rock formations, and so evokes a dynamic, exciting feeling, as well as connecting the earth plane with the vertical. Once the visual thrust of the group is determined, the relationship between the size and spacing of the rocks is paramount. Proportion, measured in terms of relative size of rocks and the spaces between them, conveys a sense of movement in the direction of the flow, as well as a rhythmic quality. So it is one of the fundamental space structuring tools. Proportional relationships have the power to evoke such aesthetic feeling as movement, depth, harmony, and serenity. By far, the most common proportion used is the golden ratio, approximated in a 1:3 or 2:3 relationship. The rhythmic interplay of major and minor rock groupings gives the garden a feeling of harmony and unity. At the same time, because the power of asymmetrical balance is at play, we feel remarkable energy and vitality as our eye zigs and zags across and into the garden's interior. Like rocks, plants are selected and placed in composition to suggest the special feeling of the plant's home in nature. The designer draws upon various forms of scenic beauty experienced in the region in which the garden is being created. Plants have their own qualities which can be used to enhance the sense of scale in the site. Fine textured plantings near or around the base of a prominent rock suggest a forest cover or upland meadow. The scale of the rock is also amplified by the traces of moss and other serendipitous small plants, such as arbor vitae seedlings or wildflowers that have naturally sprouted to grace the jagged outcroppings. Trees can be used like ballet dancers, so that the S-curve movement of their trunk and branches leads the eye into the composition. Shrubs and ground covers can be used to evoke hillside fields or the forest floor. At a sensory level, this kind of massing also lends a relaxing, tranquil ambiance. Wildflowers, like these irises, and other plants such as ferns, are used sparingly as grace notes in the composition. Slawson was also inspired by the hillsides rising to bluffs in the Minnesota landscape. He saw hillsides covered with the native spreading juniper, so for the primary ground cover, he chose 2 different types of spreading juniper and this sedum to simulate this effect. The fine texture of juniper, like sedum and moss, enhances the sense of scale, the impression that we are viewing a much larger landscape than the actual measurements would suggest. In this sense, Japanese landscape design uses techniques similar to those of painting. The other evergreen shrubs, mugo pines, yews, and bird's nest spruce, give structure and added depth to the landscape. They suggest tree-covered hills, as opposed to the meadows suggested by the juniper and sedum. The pines give further character, suggesting lone, wind-blown trees on exposed hillsides. The garden's relationship to its surrounding space is of vital importance. Rather than surrounding the garden with a fence, Slawson let the plant materials create a soft transition into the surroundings. He wanted viewers to sense that such beautiful scenery was part of their regional landscape, and not something quaintly Japanese. When we experience the beauty of nature in the small space of the Garden of Quiet Listening, we are connected with the landscape of the surrounding region. We can feel what it would be like to value that landscape and nurture it, work with it instead of destroy it. As time passes, the designer's vision comes to maturity. Success depends on many factors: the quality of the original design, the skill and vision of the gardener to shape each plant according to its nature and role in the garden, and the willingness of the garden's owner to support garden improvements as new needs arise. The plantings in the Carleton garden have thrived under the care of head gardener Mary Bigelow and 2 or 3 committed volunteers. Every summer they work carefully and steadily on the pruning and shaping of the key plantings, as well as the routine sweeping, weeding, and minor repairs of the fence and viewing shelter.
The idea then is to do as Margaret did earlier this week, bring this down to a level that has pleasing shape, and then remove what would continue to sprout and add to this kind of an irregular appearance. So we're taking off the new growth, the growth buds, shaping, and then pulling out leaves, seeds, other things that have fallen in. And so no new growth, no life, no reason to have it in here.
Yeah.
It looks like she must have pruned it back to here, and a new bud came out here, which this will be preferable to have this more interesting line. We'll let this become the new leader over here, and then prune that back out to here.
Up there.
Yeah.
Need a hose.
It's always in transition. The garden is never finished. Something needs changing. The trees get large, and now a sunny area becomes shady, so plant materials get changed. They'll die out because they don't have sun anymore. Some things will improve because something else is removed. So shady areas will become sunny again. sunny areas get shaded out, diseases happen, insects happen, natural disasters, people fall in shrubberies, there's snow load. Things are always changing, and the trick is to just keep up with it and try and make it as attractive as possible. The hope is that the designer and consultant can express to me what it is he wants to see, so that even when he's not here, I have an understanding of what he wants, and then along the way I have to make judgment calls and determine the shape or position or existence in some cases of some of these plant materials. By this point, I've gotten a pretty good idea about the direction of this garden and its particular needs and microclimates and what works, what doesn't, what I think is attractive, and what I think will become attractive in the garden.
As a work of art in progress, the Japanese-style garden requires the gardener not only to preserve the garden's design, but to enhance and refine it. This while making the constant adjustments and modifications demanded by the forces of nature and the changing needs of the garden's owners. In the Carleton garden, this process is aided by having the designer return each spring to work with the gardener to plan improvements and make any necessary changes. This aesthetic dialogue is directly responsible for the enduring value placed in the garden by those who visit and those who work in the garden itself.
As you're working with Mugo pine, you kind of know what it wants to do and what it won't do. You're working with it as opposed to really against it. If you're in a really bad mood and you have to prune and you're kind of grumpy about it or the weather's bad, it really reflects in the shrub that you're working on. So your emotions really get projected into your final work.
And this is just this little enclave of serenity amidst craziness, and it's nice to get away from the world, and you really do feel like you're on another planet in here. I mean, so I would come here a lot after a long run or a really long day. I would just walk over here and decompress for a while. So I'm gonna miss this garden.
That when you're stimulated by something this balanced and beautiful, it has an effect on your entire being that elevates it, no question.
In the final analysis, the garden changes the way we look at the world around us. In full circle, nature first inspires the designer, but in the end, the garden inspires its viewers to see the natural world in a new and deeper way. Up close or at a distance, we come to appreciate nature's rich design. The garden of quiet listening ultimately becomes the master teacher who speaks on behalf of the beauty of the natural world.